And so do you see this as a version of panpsychism? What's your current thoughts on how it relates to that way of thinking about consciousness?
Yeah, it shares some aspects of panpsychism, which, after all, some of the brightest minds in the West have had, right? You know, going back all the way to Plato, even before, and of course in Buddhism or other Eastern form of philosophy, it's always been very popular that consciousness may be much more widespread than, you know, particularly in the monotheistic world, where either we say, well, it's only humans have it, or now in the modern world we say, well, it's humans and, you know, great apes and maybe orcas, you know, and whales and a few other sort of charismatic megafauna have it. But this says no. It very likely feels like something. In each case, I have to say it's a question of, you actually have to look at the circuitry of the brain. But if I, for example, I studied the bee, you know, the bee has 1 million neurons. Right? Its circuit density is 10 times higher than the circuit density of cortex. Okay, right now we have no chance, you know, of modeling. No one has fully modeled ever the vast complexity of this heavily, you know, feedback circuit, for example, in the mushroom bodies of a bee. And so it is quite likely that it feels like something to be a bee. Now, a bee doesn't have a voice in its head. You know, it's not flying around wondering what it's going to do on the weekend. That requires probably a much bigger brain. But, you know, I find it very easy to assume, in fact, this is what I'm assuming, that when the bee is, you know, flying around in this golden sunlight, it's warm, it's just, you know, it's just taking some golden nectar and it's flying, you know, home to its hive, it may feel some sense of happiness. You know, it has hormones, octopamine and other hormones. It may feel, you know, some simple measure of happiness. And when it encounters a predator, it may feel some simple measure of fear or pain. I find that not all that implausible. The question is, how do we test that? You know, so we have to be very careful in each case. We have to think about ways of testing that. And testing it, of course, in a bee, I mean, people are trying to do that in flies and in bees. It's doable, but one has to carefully think about it for each animal system. How do I know that the animal in question has a feeling and it's not just behavior? But that question also rises with you, James, right? How do I know you aren't just a zombie nodding like you get me, but there's really nothing inside of you? You're just blank, you're just behavior. How do I know that? Well, I believe I know that, and I take this fully on trust, because I know I mean, our evolution, you know, we share all this evolution. I know if you come to the lab and I put you in a scanner, I'm going to see a brain. So, you know, I argue by analogy, because your brain is so similar to my brain. It would be really strange if I had one set of laws that gave rise to consciousness, but you with a very similar brain had a radical different set of laws, and you would be a zombie. And this argument extends and mutatis mutandis to, you know, dogs and cats and mice and invertebrates and, you know, creatures that may be very different from us. But ultimately, of course, we can't just have intuition. Ultimately, we need a theory that tells us what are the true criteria for consciousness.
Yeah, I completely agree that I think once you take that step away from solipsism, once you assume you're not the only mind in existence and I'm willing to grant you consciousness, why not a great ape then at that point? Why not a monkey? And as you start to, there's not a hard boundary, right, between humans and other animals. And I completely agree. These days, my intuition is very much that, as you say in the subtitle of your most recent book, that consciousness is very widespread. And in the case of the bee, I think these days, I think to imagine that a bee is not conscious, it would have eyes but not see, which to me sounds stranger than granting it consciousness. That it has these visual sense organs and it has no vision. I can't imagine what that would be like. I mean, obviously it wouldn't be like anything, I guess. But
that's correct.
You write in your book as well about the origins of this in kind of different cultures, about Abrahamic religion kind of centering humans and that being something that maybe has thrown off our intuitions here.
Yeah, I think that's particularly in Western culture. I mean, famously, René Descartes talks about this, right? He writes, when your carriage hits a dog and, you know, the dog yelps horribly. I don't know whether he really believed this, but, you know, he argued, yeah, he's just a machine. That's just res extant, right? So he had this famous division of the entire world into cognitive stuff and physical stuff, right? Physical stuff that is extension, res extensa, that we all have, but then we humans also have this cognitive stuff. And I find this sort of absurd to presuppose this is complete non sequitur. Of course, this was way before the theory of evolution, right? And so, as you pointed out, you know, if we have it, well, do all of us have it? What about babies? What about people who are severely, you know, retarded? What about it, you know, a severely demented patient? So even you, when you're drunk, when you're on drugs, when you're sleep deprived, you know, all of those cases, when you're on an anesthesia, you're not fully conscious or maybe only be partial conscious. So it waxes, wanes in each one of us on a daily cycle. It waxes and wanes over our lifetime. And then, yeah, if you look at it in other animals, it also waxes and wanes. And where does it peter off? It's at this point, a difficult question to answer. You know, where can you be sure that there is no consciousness?
And it seems if you take the
question to answer.
Yeah, if you take the intrinsic causal power line of IAT, I suspect that bacteria, single-celled organisms, would have some level of consciousness. Is that right?
Yes, because even a single protozoa has already, you know, a billion proteins of 10,000 different kinds of vast complexity that no one has ever modeled. Right? I mean, we tend to forget that even single cells are, you know, are the outcome of 4 billion years of evolution, are incredible complex. And so, yes, it may feel like something to be a protozoa, and once it's dissolved, it doesn't feel like anything anymore. Now, one way I think about it is a little bit when I think about how hot is deep space. Deep space famously has a background radiation, right, that's left over from the original Big Bang, right, 2 degrees Kelvin or something like that. So for you and me, that's utterly cold, right? We couldn't survive there. But according to physics, there's still a little bit of thermal motion there, right? So there's really a tiny, tiny itty bit of heat still left in interstellar space. So that's the way I think about it. It's a very graded quantity. We have obviously a lot of it, but you could imagine that other creatures now in the future or in other, you know, around other stars may be vastly more conscious, or maybe like in Lems Solaris, you know, maybe there's some sort of organisms, or like the entire planet, this ocean surrounding this planet that may be conscious. Difficult to say at this point.